Kopano is more than a meeting. Kopano is a coming together. It is a communion. At once, it is a summons, it is an assembly, it is a bonding. It's a bonding of minds, of spirits, of bodies, of ancestries, of future generations. It's about building linkages from our past into our present and well into the future. Let's not kid ourselves about the seriousness of the moment. There is a heavy price being paid by people who are highly visible in stigmatized communities. So we can no longer afford to operate in silos, we can no longer afford to operate in competition, and we certainly can't afford to operate in isolation. And that's why we have gathered here this week, to formulate collective strategy development spaces in which a range of us from different backgrounds can come together and map a way forward for all of us. In this regard, I think this is more than just your typical conference. This is a solutions-focused conference, gathering, and it's your Kopano. We're about to have a discussion this morning, but I'd like to invite everyone to feel free to participate, to feel free to take ownership of the conversations that are going to be taking place. Because as you go back to your area, to your part of the world, perhaps we can all reach some kind of consensus about a way forward for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce my panelists. Our first panelist is Danilo da Silva, who's a founding member of the first LGBT organization in Mozambique. He's a strong advocate for advancement of LGBT rights, not only in his country, but in the region and globally. He is at present Lambda's executive director. That's the Mozambican Association for Sexual Minority Rights. Please welcome Danilo da Silva. Anyway, you choose. Our next panelist is Ricky Jositao, whose background is in international relations with a particular focus in international human rights law. She has vast experience working in the NGO sector, and she's very passionate about advancing the lives of gender minorities, particularly those that do not conform or challenge gender binarisms and norms. Please welcome Ricky Jositao. Our final panelist is Linda Bauman, who is a feminist, a human rights and communications activist who specializes in human rights of women, girls, and LGBTI people. Currently the strategic advocacy coordinator of Namibia's Diverse Women's Association. Please welcome Linda Bauman. I'm going to take a seat over here.
It's good to be sharing.
So our conversation this morning is what changes have been happening for and against LGBTI people in Southern Africa. And for the benefit of the audience, I'd like us to use these as key touch points: the political, social, economic, cultural, legal, and civic. Before we get started, I happened to eavesdrop on a conversation Ricky and Linda were having backstage. And I thought it was an excellent entry point into our conversation this morning. Because when we have these discussions about what is happening, where we are going, we often lose sight of where we have come from. And quite often we locate where we have come from either in the colonial period or in the post-independence period, as if these discussions were not happening before colonialism, as if we didn't have names or language or words or ways of seeing the discussions that we are having. And I thought before we get, and we'll very quickly get into the present, but as a way of entering this discussion, I think, shall we start at the beginning? Because no one today is having conversations about what it means to be human. What names do we have for human beings? we assume we know those things. So let's take our conversation to the pre-colonial period. And I'm going to ask you to lead us in this way, Ricky, because you spoke quite passionately about it. Why is it important to make sure that as we go forward, we locate ourselves in history in the appropriate and correct way?
Thank you, Melanie. Good morning to everyone. I think the conversation that Linda and I were having, I think you can chip in, my friend, wherever you want to, was about trying to also counter this narrative that is prevailing, that often goes to say that what we represent as LGBTI persons and advocates thereof, or communities that we are representing and speaking for, is a Western ideology. It's a Western narrative, which often speaks to saying that it's un-African because it has never existed. And what we've come to establish that is not necessarily an issue of that we have never existed as a people, or what we stand for has never come to exist or to be, but that the language that we use inherently, which is obviously a Western language, when we speak into an old Gogo in the rural areas, trying to explain to them what transgender means, and you're using English, there is that barrier that already exists. But what we failed to do, I think, for the longest time has been locating how an African person, pre-colonial Africa in itself, was able to integrate somebody of my kind, for instance, within community. And I was sharing with Linda, and we've spoken about this a couple of times before, where using my own personal narrative from a great-grandmother of mine who passed on, who had spoken about an intersex uncle of my mother's who existed, and somehow an appeasement ceremony that was done in order for them to be able to raise this person according to how they identified and how the ancestors themselves guided them to be able to actually raise this particular person who became an uncle, but having been assumed to have been born female and expectedly to be a girl. That in itself speaks to a very old generation of people who understood diversity, who understood difference in a way where they did not use the language that we're using right now. And as such, that's why it continues to become an African conversation, because we're using an African language to be able to speak to what is it that we're trying to actually get across as a point. So I think it's important that we also visit our rich history as Southerners. I think in the Southern African context specifically, we have had, the session that just happened now before us of just calling in the spirits itself, this is what an African person uses to be able to communicate to the universe that they exist within. And as such, I think that is important to be able to locate where persons like us, how they existed within that very context, before we come to using the English language as a medium of communicating the identities that we are and the issues thereof.
And that made us wonder, what is our narrative as Southern African LGBTI people, or as Africans, at a broader spectrum? Mm-hmm. Because when we talk about language in our spaces, we keep on advancing the translation of this Western language without translating our native narrative that needs to come across. But also because we have not transformed our level of discussion around our ideology, and the systems that are coming with it, and the institutions that have ensured that our narrative does not pass through. And that initially says we need to redefine ourselves, we need to find ourselves so that we are able to advance it. We were just saying that when we go into our rural areas and do outreach or sensitization, it's easier for us to engage. But when we shift back to Pretoria or to Windhoek as a city, the language changes again and it's very westernized. So it basically means within that sphere of time, of moving from one space to another, there's a loss of identity. And I think that is why we need to find that narrative in this space to be able to define who we are, because we're at a tipping point, as we were saying, as Southern Africa. Absolutely. In the LGBTI movement in the continent, we're actually the most further in our discourse. And I think that we need to now nurture to find out how did we get there, what defined us, and what is it that we need to advance in order to ensure we find that heritage of who we are.
Danilo, let me bring you into this conversation. In Mozambique, you've achieved particular success recently in terms of dealing with legal issues and dealing with the penal code. One of the things that struck me as I was thinking about today's discussion were words spoken by the Ugandan president, Museveni, who said, it's not that it doesn't exist in Africa, we keep quiet about it. And if I frame what we've already started talking about, how do we make sure that that silence that Museveni talks about stops, that not talking about it stops? And can you share from your particular perspectives your success in being able to come to the table and changing the legislation?
I think that is it working? Okay. I think that our success is due to the way we do our things back home in Mozambique, which is we are part of several networks. We believe that this struggle is a struggle that should be shared and should have more people participating rather than just LGBT people. We align ourselves with the feminist movement, for instance. From our inception, we started engaging with the feminist movement. We consider ourselves as a feminist, part of feminist movement. Changing the law was a process, I would say a very long process that also was a very learning process for us in terms of how we would engage in a broad spectrum of our society. Activists are important. Our silence can no longer be tolerated. I don't think that at this point we will go back into silence as Museveni wants us to be. We have to raise our voices as human beings, as citizens, as people who aspire the same rights as any other citizen. So in this way of thinking, of going together, I would like for us also to reflect if we as the community, as we as the LGBT movement, are we going together? I'm saying, are we also connecting with other movements? Are we engaging with them in a more constructive way? I have this feeling that we've been working in isolation from other movements. When I was coming this morning and yesterday up to this venue, I was looking at the people at the bottom of the hill, and I was looking and thinking, in which way my struggles would link with the people at the bottom of the hill where we saw the realities there. Are we as the LGBT movement also struggling for social justice as a whole, or are we just fighting for freedoms of expression and freedoms of association, but forgetting that we as LGBT people are part of a larger struggle, which is the situation that most of our people live back in the country?
I think that's a very crucial point you've made. In my introduction, I spoke about how we cannot operate in silos, we cannot operate in competition, and we cannot operate in isolation. And what you've said there about locating these struggles alongside feminism and other issues, because we're all affected by the same things in terms, of inequality, for example. In terms of education, in terms of access to public health care. These are all issues that affect us alongside the agenda that we have. And so perhaps we need to have a conversation around how visibility has become a factor. Is it aiding us or is it holding us back? Linda.
Yeah, I think it's both lengths. And let me pick up from what Danilo was saying. I think where we're coming from in our movement is that we've worked and devoted our time within the human rights sector, and building those intersectionalities has been a struggle, all very individualized by institution. And I think that is why you find the inequalities within our own movement around advancing and building intersectionalities. And I think that initially speaks to a greater discourse that is required for us to advance, and also for us to unpack the masks and the layers we have. Because Linda is not just a lesbian or a gender non-conforming person, she's first a woman and she's black. There's all these layers that needs to come off, which means I belong to quite a number of sectors. And I think that discussion hasn't taken place in our movement. And I think that's the discussion that is missing, because when we come into spaces, it's about strategies. It's about what do we want to get done. And so the visibility there of, yes, in terms of our visibility, you could see in Southern Africa, in countries itself, that there's been a growth of organizations or associations of movements starting. With that amplification came in around where people are more visible, where our countries are able to see us, they're able to know that we're around, but that also played against us because of our lack of a comprehensive agenda that builds intersectionalities, that built into the transformative agenda in our countries. And I think that's where we go wrong. That is why in our countries you'll be able to see the individualized LGBTI people who are identified in isolation from the greater movement. And that also further extends to what does it mean in terms of our political landscape and visibility. And I think that, again, has a great impact around how our political landscape is out there with our history of where we are coming from. If, for example, I'll make an example of my country. Southern Africa right now is in a rife whole election preparation process. And we know that there is visible and invisible culture of a political culture in our region. When something happens in Mozambique, the transformation or the impact could also be at another country. And we know that is how our political discussions are. That is why SADC is also known as a toothless a structure or mechanism we have, because there's a more culture around a buddy system, comrade. But we forget that we were all part of these struggles of comradeship. We are not using those tools to apply them in our movement. And I think that's where the disconnection for me comes in. I was very active in our political, and still is very active. But where one has learned is that it's the same thing. That's why I admire the processes that are happening in countries. A lot of Southern African countries had advanced at policy level reform. But then at legislative reform, that's where the problem is, because now this is where you're compromising the political landscape in your country. That is why Festus Mogae could say, I can't compromise elections for a minority agenda. So what did we do? We let it go. Because why? We don't engage political parties to be able to put it forth that we are part of their parties. We belong in those parties. We need to claim it. But what do? We toy forgetting about who we are and setting forth other agendas. And I think that, again, impedes on the visibility. It's pro and con. So there's been benefits and there hasn't been. But I also think in the whole continent, Southern Africa has actually risen in terms of its amount of impact and transformation that we've done.
And I think as well, adding to what Linda is speaking to, if you're looking at our sub-region in itself, she and I were having that conversation around the fact that Southern Africa is a tipping sub-region. And I think quite a lot of that has come from the influence that every transformation, like Linda is speaking, that happens in one country, how it influences the neighboring states in themselves. And I think there's a lot of opportunities that have also risen for us as LGBTI activists and advocates. If you're looking, for instance, at our court systems within Southern Africa currently, which I think I could speak to the example of Zimbabwe in itself, and looking at cases like your Ricky Nathanson, who's actually gone further to sue the state for unlawful arrest and detention, which in it has also brought about a recognition of her own trans identity and her trans status, that I think presents an opportunity to further then that recognition that the court has given, to be able to hold the state accountable, that if our court systems are able to recognize that we actually exist in the identities that we are, then programs and services, social services, need to be able to be tailored to what our needs as these particular individuals. Ricky Khositao's case in Botswana in itself, which has also then brought to the table the discussion around gender minorities, specifically transgender persons, where the country in itself at a social level is having a conversation about the existence. And Bongani, it's what you were speaking about, how visibility in itself is not just a win, but an opportunity to continue the conversation that needs to be had with those that have been in denial for a long time about our existence. Like you were speaking about Museveni's comments, we've forever been kept as the secrets, as the hush-hush kind of conversations that need not come to the main table. But we're at a point currently where we are using our own judicial systems to be able to hold our countries and our states accountable for our rights. And I think it's important that we also connect those very struggles to the greater struggles of all other persons. If you're looking at the concept of Ubuntu or Botho in Setswana, that speaks to that, I am because you are. When we're talking about educational transformation and the limitations thereof of our existing educational systems, Yes, we need to be speaking about the fact that we are LGBTI individuals, but the fact that many of us are marginalized in one way or the other, that means we need to also be at the table when we are discussing how to transform our educational system so that then each and every individual is able to actually actualize into what they want to become, and they're able to meet their own goals. You're looking at the South African context currently, where we have quite a lot of litigation that is ongoing, trying to also push for legislative reform around, for instance, the same-sex act, which is the Civil Union Act in itself, and the disjointer between that and the Old Marriage Act in itself. That's a conversation that we're only beginning to have around why is it that we have two pieces of law, for instance, that are governing the same exact right or access to marriage in itself. And we need to be able to escalate that to a point of having a conversation with every other person and not necessarily bringing it from just an individual stance of being LGBTI individuals, but the fact that if this is a right that is meant for every person, then it should be then legislated or then regulated by one single act in that context. So there's a lot of opportunities that are arising if you're looking at just from our judicial system in itself, and you're looking at other human rights mechanisms. I mean, the Namibian context currently, with the work that they're doing with the ombudsman on that side, there's a lot of material that has been developed currently, which the ombudsman is putting forward a very clear position in terms of how discrimination and hateful practices that are done towards any minorities, be it religious minorities, sexual minorities, gender minorities, or even cultural minorities, we need to be a part of those very conversations. And these are kind of opportunities that are arising around the sub-region that we need to take advantage of. And insofar as visibilizing ourselves, being visible at the very table where those discussions are happening.
So we've spoken about visibility, we've spoken about solidarity, if I may frame it that way. And I suppose one of the questions one has to ask, that beyond what we may achieve or what may be achieved from a legislative point of view, are we making any headway in terms of, for lack of a better word, the cultural wars? We've seen an explosion in terms of the digital revolution. We've seen social media in terms of transforming attitudes in general. I mean, South Africa is a very instructive case study where the laws have often been ahead of prevailing attitudes that continue to make this country, in some ways, one of the most dangerous for LGBTI people in terms of people's lived experiences. What barriers still need to be broken, and are we taking advantage of the digital revolution and the cultural wars that can still be fought in that space?
I myself is one of the people that have been advocating for more kind of gradual approach instead of radical changes. I think that in the past recent years there is a huge emphasis into criminalization and making legal frame changes and overlooking the most important part of our struggle, which is to change the hearts of minds of people. And I think that that is also because other external agendas when it comes to priorities, which are unfortunately being set outside of our spaces. I believe that we have to engage with the common man. We as LGBT activists have to stop talking in such high-level discussions and start to engaging with the common man. Because at the moment it seems that it's so sophisticated discussions, and the people at the ground, they are not understanding all these terminologies that we are using. So we as activists, as people who are concerned about the future, we have to go deeper. And in the way of doing that is not in a rush, as some of us have been pushed to, take into consideration that social change and social attitudes, they take time to change. And using technology, I think, is one of the key strategies that we must be look at. Cell phones in Africa are all over. Many places in Africa you will find not a smartphone, but you always find a phone. people communicate, how we as activists are using those tools to advance as our rights. As we were speaking earlier about the context, I also would like to touch the issue of our region. We said that, as Linda was saying, that Southern Africa is the tipping point of all this LGBT activism. But I don't believe that activism can thrive in an environment where you have erosion of democracy. From the past years, we've been witnessing this erosion of democracy, these shrinking spaces for civil society organizations to mobilize. And this is a deliberate action by governments. So are we engaging enough with other civil society organizations that promote democracy? I can operate as an LGBT activist in an environment which is hostile to any form of organization. So I think we should also invest in that. Are we paying attention that our region has been suffering from economic slowdown for the past 2 years? People are losing jobs. People don't have the opportunities. And governments such as Tanzania government, they are using those anxieties to manipulate people. And the easiest targets are the LGBT people. Are we paying attention at our economy? Are we in the rooms where economic issues are being discussed? How much our governments are getting from this big money that is coming into the region? Southern African region is very rich. We have almost everything, but we now have these international companies that are coming. They don't pay attention to human rights. So are we engaging in those discussions? We are not engaging in those discussions. Our agenda, which was a good strategy in the beginning, was an HIV entry point. But sometimes I feel that we are leaving a lot of things behind because of an HIV agenda, which I myself am kind of frustrated that every discussion that I go to, we are talking about LGBT people and HIV. I would like to be talking about LGBT people and economic empowerment. I would like to be talking about LGBT people also in political parties and political engagement. Because as we were saying earlier, we are more than LGBT people. We are African citizens. We need to engage politically. We need to engage culturally. And also, we need to see our struggle in a more broader way than we are kind of focusing these days.
Yes, our struggle is inextricably bound with every other struggle that our compatriots are facing wherever they may be found. And I think that's why I was raising the question of the cultural war, the winning of the hearts and minds. You want to come in?
I think, speaking to winning hearts and minds, Bongani, it's important to also look at opportunities that have arisen in Southern Africa. Looking at building champions within our communities and using persons that have influence in communities. Specifically, I'm looking at your cultural leaders and looking at your religious leaders. We have a lot of visible individuals who are leaders in these particular spaces that are willing and wishing to come to the table as our own champions to be able to pioneer our issues in the church, within the cultural setting in itself. But we're not taking advantage or full advantage of these particular individuals that exist. But I think it's important that we use that kind of a strategy where we're talking about that intersection. There is an LGBTI person who goes to church. There is an LGBTI person who is a minister. And I think there are even some of them who are reverends who are in the space, who are LGBTI identifying. How are we using these particular individuals to then win over the minds of those women in the churches, in your mañanos? How are we using those particular individuals who are leaders of the youth sector of churches themselves? And that is important because then we are not then going to continue being the persons carrying the torch. Then we actually transfer the baton to those that can be able to use those. And I think it's important that organizations, I think for the longest time, taking stock of where our movement comes from, religion has been an area that for the longest time is one that has been, it continues to be a source of frustration, a source of violence, a source of pain and hurt, and ostracization. But at the same time, there are certain individuals, particularly in the Southern African context, that are very visible, that are very, very open to say, we are here and we are in support of you as individuals and as communities. How can you use us and how can you connect with the work that we are doing such that then you don't have to be in these particular spaces where we are leading to be talking this very language and talking the discourse? How can you be able to then equip us with what is it that is your issues and your main concerns so that then we can carry them over into the spaces where we have some level of influence? Going into your traditional and rural areas is quite important to be able to connect with the leaders in a language that they understand. And I think that has always been very important, that I think we have totally not invested enough in actually interrogating and investing in understanding what language do we use in our vernacular, in our Setswana, in your Sevenda, in your Zulu. What do we call a gay person? What do we call an intersex person? Such that when we are talking to our elders, we are able to talk to them in a language that they understand. And in so doing, this is how we build all these champions that we need. Further to that, I think there's a lot of interest that is coming from parents of LGBTI persons that we need to invest quite a lot in bringing them much more closer and documenting these particular narratives of parents who are in support of their own children who are LGBTI identifying, for instance, and being able to use them as the tools to be able to influence other parents alike, so that then we also have a community of us, not just as individual LGBTI persons, but our significant other as well journeying with us, and also being able to influence the minds and hearts of those that they engage with. The parent has to go to work. The parent has to go to the church. The parent has a social club that they belong to. They go to a Stockfell with some other mamas that they go to on a Sunday. Those are spaces where we need these champions to be confident enough with language that they can be able to be proficient in, to be able to speak to others who they engage with in those particular levels. So I think that is important to also then continue to widen the scope of those that we are engaging with and not being the solitary voices that are speaking on our behalf.
That's why I think it was very important for us to start the discussion in the way that we have, because those names, that language exists. Linda.
Yes, in terms of the digital, my head zone went immediately to the issue of the right to information and access to education. And I think that again stems back to the importance around how we shape our agenda around ensuring that social media and all forms of media is able to be held accountable also. And I think that is what our states speak to. What statutory position are you putting forth? So if in my country, if we are talking about, we need to make sure that in our education curriculum that we want sexuality education in it, for example, they would want you to come from a very statutory basis to actually say what transformation do you want to do. So if we speak to access to information, we're looking at media is being regulated in our countries. We know for a fact the defamation that comes with our identities, also that comes from these spaces that are supposed to advance it, while we know the freedom of expression has mainly been on social media, which in Southern Africa, we are very fortunate that that is not that much regulated. And I think that is a cusp where we can actually acknowledge the amount of transformation of people being able to read in their safe spaces and comforts, to be able to understand people that they're not able to access, but also information that they don't have due around it. But if you flip the coin, there are people outside the spaces who have a Tamagotchi phone but don't have access to social media. How do we make sure that they get access to information in that regard? That is why my linkage is about how do we take the issue of language, how do we take the issue of access to information, how do we take the issue of access to education in a form that will keep our states accountable in order for that transformation to be comprehensive, appropriate, and also accessible to everybody. And I think that's what is key for us to be able to set that agenda in order for us as Southern Africans to be able to see how we're able to use the mechanisms, because there's also a lot of Southern African mechanisms that guides the operations of ethics and visibility thereof.
I suppose my biggest takeout so far is that really we need to move away from, shall we call it, navel gazing, where we are only focused internally around our issues and our struggles, and really try and seek for opportunities where we can engage, where we can be visible in all spheres, in all areas, so that whatever gains we achieve, we are also achieving for our societies at large. Let me allow some room for questions from the floor. I don't know if anyone wants to engage our panelists in terms of the discussion so far. Please, may we have your comment or question?
Hello, my name is Kanyanta from Iranti. So I have questions for all of us and kind of like statements at the same time. How political leaders, if they want to be allies with us and work with us, how that would compromise their elections and what they're working towards if they're working for a minority agenda. So around that, I wanted to find out how are we, navigating using those opportunities and engaging with those leaders to try and win them over and see, not win them over, but get them on our side and see our point of view and kind of engage them at a public level. Okay. My second point is around how well we're working together to, strategize around the different things we're working on and the different roles we have. Of course, we have many different organizations focusing on many different things, but are we all focusing on the things we need to be focusing on? And that leads me to the third point, which is how can we work together to take advantage of things like, for example, digital revolution, right? How can we then collectively work together as a region to bring all our ideas to the table and kind of say, where do we go with this?
Okay. Let's leave it at those three, and also
Okay.
let's make sure we take other questions as well. Is there anyone? We've got a question over there. Okay, the instruction is please let's have one question per person. I want to take 2 or 3 so that you can answer them in one go. Do we have another question? Anyone else? We've got a question over here.
Continua as comrades. As activists as well, Danilo, you mentioned the conversations we are having. The English is a bit too sophisticated for me. What happened to that child that is in the rural establishment whereby he is born? Why are they not visible in these spaces? Let us empower them, because they are the ones who are getting hurt every day. They are the ones that we are reading about who are being raped. They are not aware of these happenings. It's my only fear that at these happenings is duplicated faces that are being coming to these events. So. Okay. My main thing is that empowerment, please.
Okay, we've got a question there at the back, please. May I ask you to stand? Yes?
It's a short comment on the use of media, especially social media. In Malawi, we tried to break homophobia using the media. And when we used the TV, newspapers, and radio, at least it was okay. But when we took the same to social media, there was a backlash, a lot of hate comments, a lot of homophobic comments that we had to switch off the social media aspect, despite the digital revolution that we have, and concentrated on the conventional media. Thank you. That was our experience in a project that we implemented in Malawi.
Okay, but a comment over here.
I was just wanting to say about the breaking out of silos, not working in isolation and not in competition, because for me, that is spot on. But now I have the Sangoma coming, which I appreciate very much, because it's in our space for us who have denied bringing into our public spaces how much our traditional spirituality means for us. But now I'm asking, why is the Sangoma not at the table? Yes. Meaning, I'm not judging. I'm glad you have a panelist. What I'm asking is that when we move forward and accelerate, we will have, at all the panels, have the spiritual voices and have them do it, not just talk. Do it. Let us have like the dancing, because that breaks down the barrier limits we do have and will still have for many years.
Okay. We'll take one final one here, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond. We'll take one final.
It's not a question, but I think it's a comment. I'm from Lesotho. what happened is we were having a training for members of parliament, and Tampos, I know he is here. He narrated the experiences as a LGBTI person he is experiencing. And you know, I think after his presentation, 20 minutes later, one of the parliamentarians, there were about 40, said, you know what, if I didn't hear the story, if one of the people whose LGBTI was being killed, I would have a hand killing those people. I was even more humbled because a week later, one of the guys, who's a member of parliament, went to national radio and TV and advocated for LGBTI. So I think it's very important to share stories, bring people who are really affected by these things to share their own personal stories because they have a very big impact on those. For example, I was just a lawyer who's not interested. But by virtue of my friend who introduced me to real life stories, I was like, no, I should help the cause. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any of you can respond to any of the points or questions raised.
Okay. Mine goes to one of the questions that Kanyanta asked, which is around the example that Linda spoke to of our former president in Botswana, Festus Mogae, having left office and only then beginning to speak for and on behalf of the LGBTI cause in itself, and looking at what can we do currently. There are avenues that exist. I mean, looking at the SADC Parliamentary Forum, which meets regularly, that is a space that is also open to us as activists and advocates to be able to influence some of the parliamentarians coming from our different countries, where they convene regularly in order to be able to take stock of where the human rights discourse is at, and even the economical, socio-political environment in itself, taking stock of what advances we've made. This is a space that we're not taking advantage of, but it exists. We've used it before in 2015 and saw a very huge rise insofar as motions that have been tabled in the Parliament of Botswana, for instance, where people like your Honorable Saleshando himself, looking at people like Honorable Tsibotlogile Tsireletso, who've tabled motions in Parliament openly, even though there's a whole lot of backlash to it, around a need to actually provide a protective legislation and mechanisms for LGBTI persons and integration of them within social services. And I think we also need to go a step further and speak into certain portfolios, committees that exist within all of our parliaments in our countries, where they meet as well regularly, where we're able to actually ensure that we get a seat at the table to be able to table our issues, such that then wherever then decision is made around policy, social policy, as well as services that then need to be rendered, we ensure that then they take stock and account of the fact that we also exist and we need to be integrated and incorporated. So that is one way that I think it's quite important. And I also speak to the point that Judith was making, and also I think emphasizing the fact that it's important that we look at our own African traditional faith leaders, whom many of them are very influential, who many of them, our own families, our own friends, go to be able to seek guidance, to be able to seek whatever kind of interventions that they're looking for. How do we use them? Because there's a rich narrative in our African context of sangomas, particularly if I bring in my own trans narrative in there, of different persons who can be able to explain to you how they have been able to marry their own traditional background with their own trans identity, for instance, where we're talking about persons who are true-spirited. Those narratives are not coming out very strongly whenever we're speaking, because we are often just talking from a sexual and gender identity, but not also speaking to the very traditional influences of some of our own expressions that exist, which is a very strong, I think, nuance that can be able to win over the minds and hearts of those that do not want to engage in this un-African kind of conversation. Bring in this very rich African narrative of how our own ancestors are also able to influence our own gender and our own expressions, essentially.
I'd like to comment on what Ricky was saying regarding engaging political parties. And as much as I agree that we have some spaces such as the African Parliament, I think that we should also start to look at in-country, how do we engage our political parties? Because parliamentarians, they are politicians, and politicians, they are answerable to their constituencies. So it seems that we just engage politicians when they are in a parliament, but not when they are in their communities. And that brings me that question of what we as LGBTQ communities are doing in terms of engaging with political parties and even running for offices. Because if you look at other contexts, change happened because LGBTQ people, they engage politically. What are we doing back home? And we also have to be cognizant that in our Southern African region, culture is really important. And we, as a people, we like consensus. And politicians, they will not take a stance if they know that there is no consensus on things. We should start building those consensus at the grassroots and bring that consensus at the national level and then at the regional level. Not just, ambush parliamentarians when they go to New York or ambush parliamentarians when they go to the African Commission. So let's start doing our homework. I'd like also to comment on the issue of sophistication in languages. I think that, and I reiterate, we must bring the language to the grassroots, what people understand and engage with people in the way they understand. And social media can help us doing that and engage that. We shouldn't be afraid of negative comments that are done in social media because those are also a barometer in terms of how society also is changing. We at Lambda, we use a lot of social media. We use a lot of Facebook. And for us, that space is a space of education, is a space of engaging with younger generations, is a transformative space. And we shouldn't be afraid of getting those negative because they are part of this.
Linda?
Yeah, I think there's a question by my comrade there around rural involvement and visibility thereof. That's a question that I want you to pose to the next group because they're going to look internally. What is our politics? Because what we're going to do, because I want to answer that question, but I think you must pose it to the next group because the divide, the movement, the shift in our movement and the exposure thereof, we know, we haven't even started that Pandora box of discussion. What is our internal politics? Why is it that it's just Linda from Namibia that keeps on getting on a plane? Why? And I think these are discussions that the next group must enhance and tap with. So in that regard, I would love to answer that question, but it's a question, and I think also a very sensitive discussion for our movement. And I think I'm hoping that Pandora box will be opened in the next discussion. So my other issue is around the advancement of, I think what we are having right now in Southern Africa is this envisioned dream that we need to work with the most high-ranked person who's able to make an immediate decision. And I think that's where we go wrong, because if I look at what we are doing right now, using champions from who are already profiled in our movement, while we haven't even acknowledged the profile of our own activists who are champions, that's already a go wrong for me. And that means we are not building leadership. We are not shifting into the national and local discourse that we're having. We are not acknowledging that there has been a shift, there has been growth, and that we actually need to also start an elders' council in our movement so that we're able to pull down wisdom, because that's where we come from. That's our political history. That is where our political parties go back to the elders who have initiated the movement. And I think that culture we don't have in our movement. And that is why we are not safe. And there's no security in our movement. That is why organizations emerge, die, leaders come, go, and that creates instability of what our agenda is collectively. Where are we heading to? And I think that is what is missing, that collectiveness. When this leader moves on to become our next prime minister or one big shot in the political leaders, Danilo is able to shift in, which means there's an evolution of growth, and we are building young people to take over. We are growing old. Just like the politicians would be saying, we also have the right to say, we're getting old in this movement.
All right. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I think that sets the discussion. I hope in a very engaging way. Obviously, there's going to be much more discussed, much more said throughout the day. But I think as a way of opening our first discussion today, once again, can we give a round of applause to our panelists?